Buongiorno. Per me
Good morning. It is a great pleasure and an honor for me to present Professor Miguel Urquiola, who will open this day rich of several events here at Collegio Carlo Alberto. Miguel Urquiola is Dean of Social Science and Professor of Economics at Columbia University. And today he will be speaking about the ability of US universities to lead scientific progress at international level, and how and the fact that this leadership might be finding some obstacles. It is a very hot topic now, and with this I'll leave the floor to Professor Urquiola.
Thanks. So while my slides come up, let me say it is a tremendous pleasure, and thank you so much, GIANLUCA, for the introduction. It's a tremendous pleasure to be here, and as was said, I'll be speaking about US universities, and let me give a little bit of the motivation for this. So the motivation basically is that US universities have changed a lot. So if you looked around 1875, let's say, the US had zero of the world's leading research universities. It was just not a country where if you were interested in sort of top-line university research, you would look at it at all. And in fact, you would see that most Americans who wanted advanced training would come to Europe. And we know that that has changed because at present, the US accounts for the majority of the top-ranked research universities in the world. So I'll be looking at why this happened and what factors led to this, and if we have a sense of what factors led to this, we might also have a sense of what factors could unravel or what the threats are. And when I started working on this topic, which was a long time ago, I wanted to quantify this a little bit. And what I did was I worked with some students and looked, we wanted to get a measure of research productivity that went very far to see how schools, very far back to see how schools did. And so what we did is looked at the biographies of Nobel Prize winners. We did not look at their nationality. We don't care where people were born. We basically care where they studied and where they worked. And when they said, I either studied or worked at a university in country A, we gave that country a citation. Okay? So when you do that, you basically get a figure that looks like this. So here we have 1875 and the year 2000, 2010, something like this. Here is the share of the Nobel Prize citations going to universities in each country. So for example, if the US has 1 point, it basically means someone who was a Nobel Prize winner said, I either studied or worked at an American university X. Okay? And what you see as a salient fact is that if you go back far enough, around 1875, I had already mentioned this, the US was basically not in the picture. None of the universities there were doing very well. Okay? And of course, we see that that changed very significantly, and also if you look far back, you had Germany, France, and the UK leading ahead of the US. These are the 4 countries over the whole period with the most citations. Now, one key question, this is a very summarized graph for those economists in the room, for example, this has a lot of smoothing. One key question would be, when did the US move ahead? When did this happen? And many cite World War II as the turning point. I cite some authors there. If you asked in the US, when did the US university move ahead, many people will say World War II. And emphasizing World War II is analytically very attractive because it basically gives you a story of why the US may have come up and also gives you a story of why Germany may have gone down. However, if you look at the data which I showed there, the data suggests that US universities were ahead well before World War II. They were ahead of all but Germany's by 1910 and ahead of all countries by 1920. So it looks to me that this is a process that basically began significantly earlier than World War II, although World War II was obviously part of the story. As an anecdote, in 1901, for example, Theodore Richards became the first American trained professor who was offered a position at a German university. And this was extremely noted because that would have never happened around, say, 1870, but people said, look, someone trained in the US, in this case at chemistry, this individual went on to win a Nobel Prize himself in chemistry, could be offered a job at at a German university. He declined it and stayed at Harvard and then became chair of that department. So basically there was already a lot going on early on. So an explanation of why the US universities did well basically should begin, in my view, much earlier, and I set that in the late 1800s. So let me tell you what the story I tell is. And this story I've told in a book called Markets, Minds, and Money, but also in some articles that I wrote a while back. And the story that I have for why this happened centers around reforms that began after the Civil War in the US, so 1870s, and understanding their impact benefits from two observations that are about the economics of education, or sort of what makes universities different than other firms. One is that the US takes, as in many parts of its economy, a free market approach to education. And what do I mean by this? New schools can easily enter. So if we wanted to open a new university in the US, we could do that pretty easily. This wouldn't guarantee success, but we would basically be able to open a school. And most of these schools enjoy substantial autonomy. So that's observation one that we can keep in mind, that the US, it's very easy to open schools and there's a free market for schools. Second observation is that universities are complex creatures and they supply a bunch of products. And one of them, which I'll focus on, is one which I call sorting. And when a university sells sorting, it basically sells the opportunity to be pooled with other people of a certain type. So for example, if you look at one school close to here, Bocconi sells instruction. It teaches people something, but it also tells people this person went to Bocconi and therefore should be associated with other people who were admitted to Bocconi and receive that type of training, puts a stamp on your head that says, I went to Bocconi, okay? That is a type of sorting. And what I'll say now is that these factors basically account for the US university's initial weakness and their later dominance. So that these factors can tell you why the US was so bad around here and why it became so good by some point in the 20th century. Okay, so let me go through it a little bit. Initial weakness, why was this there? Into the 1800s, what American households wanted from the college sector, as it was called, one thing was basically like denominational sorting. I would like to be in a school where there's people like me. And what did people like me mean? To a large extent, it meant people from the same denomination. So for example, this led to the creation of Harvard, which was created mainly by Puritans, the College of New Jersey, which we now call Princeton, which was created by Presbyterians, King's College, where I work, which we now call Columbia, which was created by Anglicans, Queen's College, which we now call Rutgers by the Dutch Reformed, and so on. So everyone was basically saying, I'd like to go to school with people who think about theology in the manner I do, Brown by Baptist. And people also said, I'd like to go to college. This is a universal tendency, ideally not too far away. These factors produced in the US massive entry. So a lot of colleges opened basically. In 1776, the US had 9 colleges, most of which we now know are part of the Ivy League. By the Civil War, 900 more had opened. So just easy to open schools, and a lot of schools open. Meanwhile, England, for example, had only 4 universities, and continental European states also limited the size of the sector a lot. The US, as in many cases, just a free-for-all with everyone opening school. Now, when you have 900 colleges, right, that are opening in this country that isn't as large, what you're going to have is that they cater to small local markets and were fairly small schools. And this is related to their weakness. So many had fewer than 100 students, and it was common to see colleges with 2, 3, 4 faculty members. The faculty, well into the 1800s, were often hired with attention to their religious affiliation, once again trying to keep the schools associated with one denomination. In 1879, Princeton President McCosh, who I cite there, said, "You are aware that the trustees, the legal owners of the university, are resolute in keeping the college like a religious one." Okay? In order to hire faculty in this period in the US, wealth-related criteria mattered too. The salaries were very low, and therefore the colleges preferred, all else equal, to hire wealthy people who therefore might be willing to teach and to work for relatively little money. Given the salience of basically religion and wealth, expertise took a back took a back seat. So in 1802, the president of Yale, President Dwight, recruited someone who became a famous a famous chemist in the US, Benjamin Silliman, to teach chemistry. So Benjamin Silliman is credited with kind of creating chemistry at Yale and, and at other schools. But when he was originally hired to be a chemistry professor, this is a quote from a book, Silliman had never studied chemistry and knew almost nothing about it. Dwight chose Silliman because he knew it would be difficult to find anyone in America with knowledge of chemistry and natural history, and he was afraid to select a foreigner. So basically, faculty were selected frequently for reasons of basically religion, not particularly for reasons of expertise. The curriculum related, what these colleges were teaching, was very narrow, and it offered no choice. So if you went to college in the US well into the 1800s, you were doing one thing. You were taking classes in Greek, rhetoric, math, natural philosophy, moral philosophy, exclusion of fields like business or engineering. Little of what we would call science now. Basically, almost nothing of what we would call experimental or sort of inductive science, and frequent use of rote learning, memorizing and things like this. And you can imagine that this made sense because if you have a small school with 2 or 3 faculty members who have to teach everything, if I asked any of the people here who teach, if you had to teach many courses and teach many things, well, asking people to memorize them becomes very attractive because you say, there's no way I can do all this stuff. And these practices help to keep costs down. A historian mentions that US colleges in this period into the 1800s hovered between genial penury and unmitigated fiscal disaster. So these were not well-funded schools. So you can see basically why if you look around 1875, you would find that the US schools were basically not very good in terms of giving advanced instruction or producing any kind of research. Basically, what the market wanted and what the massive entry was causing schools to supply was quite different from that. Okay? Meanwhile, in Europe, what was going on here in this time? Well, the European universities, since the Protestant Reformation, were already under state control. They were fewer in number, as I mentioned, basically as part of the Protestant Reformation. What European states did is basically start to restrict and to control the educational sector very closely, and so you couldn't just open a university or open a school because you liked it. They were fewer in number and much better funded than the US schools. They were staffed by often well-paid civil servant professors, in the German style, for example, assigned to institutes headed by specialized chaired faculty. These universities in Europe started to absorb the research activity located in academies like the Académie Royale or the Royal Society in London or the Berlin Academy of Sciences. This is really a period of strengthening of the universities in Europe, and you can see why places like Germany, France particularly, these schools are doing relatively extremely well relative to the US. This story I'm telling, the contrast is summarized in 2 schools. So if you look at 2 schools, one American and one German, both chartered in the middle 1700s by George II. So King George basically created both of these schools because he was king of England but also had lands in Germany. So here are 2 that he personally created. By the 1850s, Columbia, where I worked, had 6 professors and 150 students. And Göttingen, which he also created, had 90 and 1,600 students. So when you look at these 2 schools, it's not really, and these people were better paid. They were much better trained than these people. It's not a shock that basically the German school was doing much better in terms of giving advanced instruction and in terms of doing research than its counterpart to the University of Columbia in New York. I'll skip the details of the individual schools, but in that book, if you're interested, if you have a favorite school, you can go and see how it's done there. Summary. Well into the 1800s, the US universities produced little research. It was not zero. There were some faculty members who did do research, of course, but there was no concerted push to do research, and there was no return to that activity. People doing research at this point in the US did it because they liked it, not because there was any reward in their profession. For example, signaling that you belong to a given denomination, saying I'm Baptist or I'm Presbyterian, might have had a higher return as a faculty member than writing a paper, for example. And 3 factors were necessary to improve. So people looked at the US universities or US colleges at the time and realized these are very weak relative to European institutions. There's something wrong. And they began to articulate what would be necessary to change. One, schools needed to value research more. Professors needed to see research leading to rewards of some type, right, like a career. And very important, as economists, we know that if you want to improve anything, or as there are business people at this conference also, if you want to improve anything at a firm or at an institution, you need to measure performance and see sort of who is a good worker, are you doing well? There basically needed to be measures of performance in the US. So around the Civil War, all of this began to change, and you basically began to see development. Okay, so let me tell that story. As industrialization in the US advanced, colleges failed to satisfy a lot of demand, and they began to realize also, like, we're not training people in medicine, in business, in engineering, nor in chemistry or economics or stuff like this. And there started to be several attempts at reform. Now, anyone who works at a university knows that it's very hard to change anything at a university, and the attempts at schools like Brown, Harvard, or Union mainly failed. So basically, people would say, let's try to change this, but there were several factors ranging from the, quotes, business model that the school had been employing to resistance by the faculty. These are all stories. I go through some of them of failure. Success arrived in the US partially because of this issue that I've mentioned of free entry, that anyone can open a new school, and it arrived strongly with two schools that were entrants. One is Cornell, created in 1865, and Johns Hopkins in 1876. Each received major private and public funding. What Cornell started doing was offering basically specialized curricula and curricular choice. So Cornell's big innovation, it's a school that's part of the Ivy League now, but it's a new school in the grand scheme. And it became part of the Ivy League because it was a very successful school right away. And its success basically lay in telling people, look, if you want to study economics or chemistry or engineering, we'll try to offer that for you and you can choose that. Kind of like a major area of study that we did not. As I said, this was non-existent up to this point in the US. You can see how this is very appealing. Cornell became very, very successful quickly. Johns Hopkins started to emulate German university explicitly in saying we should try to hire people and try to do graduate instruction and research. Basically try to do advanced training rather than just simple training. And the president accordingly emphasized hiring based on expertise. He started saying, I don't care if I have to hire a German professor to teach chemistry, I'm going to do that, and I'm not going to care particularly whether he is a Baptist or a Presbyterian and so forth. Incumbents in any market where there starts to be firms that innovate, everyone who's there has to decide what to do, and the incumbents had to respond. So some schools like Harvard and Columbia are the two notable ones in this period, invested very heavily and changed themselves drastically to try to compete with Cornell and Hopkins, doing things like offering electives, creating graduate and professional schools. Other incumbents didn't grow as much. So for example, Princeton and Yale grew. Williams grew much less, but some schools said, we're going to keep more of our focus on undergraduate and college type instruction. So a school like Williams, which has always been wealthy and very strong, said, I'm not going to turn into a major university like Columbia, I'm going to choose to stay a college focused on undergraduate, but basically there's a lot of differentiation in this period. There was also more entry in this period. So as I said, one key fact about the US is it's easy to open new schools, and in this period you for example, see Stanford open in Chicago. The public sector starts to grow a lot. There's schools opening in California, Illinois, and so forth. Schools like MIT that are collaborations to some extent between private funding and public funding started to open. So you see a lot of schools coming in and trying to get in the game. Now these schools, as they started to say, let's do research, they demanded specialized and advanced teachers. And you won't be surprised to hear, given what I've already said, that initially these people were hard to find. So this is Harvard President Charles Eliot, probably the most influential Harvard president ever, said, there is in this country, in 1870 he said this, there is in this country a considerable body of teachers who know how to teach Latin and Greek, but if you are in search of teachers to teach botany, chemistry, physics, and so on, you cannot find them, they do not exist. So he was expressing a frustration of saying, I'm trying to change now, I'm trying to change into Johns Hopkins, so therefore I need people who teach specialized things and advanced things, I can't find them. The market responded, and different universities started to train PhD-trained specialists and basically put up people who could go to Eliot and say, I'd like a job in botany because I'm trained in botany. The other thing that as I mentioned, was important was measurement. And what you see in the US in this period is that there starts to be societies like we know well, the American Chemical Society, the American Economic Association. Groups of faculty start to get together, form these associations, and say we're going to publish a journal. And what is the journal for? Here the US was playing catch up to Europe. It's so that we can say, here's something that claims to be economics, and this group of people certifies that, that it is actually economics, and therefore that this person can do research in the area. As I said here, the US was catching up. For example, the journals in the US, like the Journal de l'École Polytechnique, had started much earlier, at least 100 years earlier. To illustrate that this was a process that took a while and that required investment, Gilman was the first president of Johns Hopkins, and he hired an English mathematician. So he couldn't find people to teach math in the US, and he said, I'm going to bring an English person, very noted mathematician by the name of Sylvester, who created in the US the first journal of mathematics, which still exists, the American Journal of Mathematics. And years later, Sylvester claimed that he did not create this journal. He said, you have spoken of our journal. Mr. Gilman tells people that I founded it, and he said, I assert that he is the founder. He said, almost the first day I landed in Baltimore, he began to plague me to found a mathematical journal on this side of the water. And he said, I resisted, there's just nothing to publish in it, he said. Again and again he returned, and again I threw cold water on the scheme. Nothing but obstinate persistence brought his views to prevail. So this is basically him telling us it was a process. There was nothing to publish initially, but it was really necessary to create journals, to have an infrastructure that would say, yes, there's someone doing mathematics, and that person is good, and therefore Johns Hopkins should hire them. So this was a fairly long process. Once this was in place, two sorting processes began. So as I said, sorting is the idea that a university does many things, but one of the things it does is it basically says, this group of people belongs together, okay? One is there started to be sorting of papers into journals, okay? So what does this mean? Everyone who's an economist here knows that economists are obsessed with what we call the top 4 or the top 5 journals. There's a top thing. This did not exist in this period. There were just new journals coming up. But basically, they're sorting in that there starts to be a differentiation between journals, and you know, you say this is the best journal, and if a paper gets in there, it means it's a high-quality paper, and that's a type of differentiation. The other one is that there started to be sorting of faculty into schools by research performance. Initially, the faculty could be anywhere, but gradually we get this thing that says, just to cite a current example, if an economist is at MIT, it must be that he or she is extremely bright. That's a pecking order, once again, a stratification you know, emerging that says MIT has a higher reputation than School X or School Y, okay? One thing that happened at that point is that schools began to compete for faculty, and what we understand as bidding wars began. That is that a school goes and tries to offer a higher salary to X or Y researcher to try to get them to be there. And you could see how now someone like the president of Harvard could go and say, I want to have the best chemistry department, and I'm going to go to Hopkins and try to hire the person who is allegedly best there. How will I know that they're the best? Because I see that they're publishing in the Journal of the Chemical Society. Chicago's Harper rated, you know, Chicago was famously based on this idea, and the first president went around trying to hire the faculty from other places, okay? Now, so this is a story of basically things changing and the US becoming much better and starting to spend much more. So one question has to be, how is this financed? I told you a story of where initially the US spent very little on higher education, and we know that now, in the OECD, for example, the US is an outlier. It spends much more on higher education than any other large industrialized countries. There are small places that spend quite a bit. But you know, the US spends a huge amount. And I also told you a story of the schools being poor. And when we think of very successful American universities now, we think of them being rich. So the question is, how did that happen? How did that change came to be? The schools that reformed, Columbia and Harvard would be two prime examples, were pleased to see enrollment grow. So you start to reform, you start to offer majors, you start to offer masters, PhDs, a medical school. You begin to see a lot of students coming in. In the early 1900s, Columbia and Harvard, which are actually relatively small schools now, especially at the undergraduate level, they're very small schools, were the largest in the country. Now, enrollment growth began to produce its own type of challenge, which is universities still served largely local markets, and enrollment growth entailed the arrival of new students. So if you look at a place like New York or Boston or Philadelphia, for example, a lot of lower income students and a lot of children of immigrants started coming in. For example, Jewish students are a salient group in this time. They basically started to be a lot of Jewish students at schools like Columbia, like Harvard, like Penn, like Yale. This threatened schools' historical sorting service because these were schools that had been identified with particular denominations of the Protestant religions. And so if you had thought that Columbia was generally a school that catered to, to wealthy Anglican boys initially from New York City, you might have said, wait a second, now there is a large number of Jewish boys also coming in. And this started to create tension in these places. Now, I have a theoretical paper with Bentley McLeod, for example, that shows that if schools' fixed costs were low and you get this type of dynamic coming in, you would expect the entry of even more schools, each of which would be small and catering to very specific types of students. But in fact, fixed costs are not slow, are basically not slow. And what started happening in these schools, including top schools now, like Yale or like Princeton, including Columbia also, is that because the students couldn't sort so easily across schools, they began to sort within schools. So this is the period where, for example, Princeton started to develop eating clubs, Yale had secret societies, Harvard had private dormitories. These are places where basically within the school you could separate from other people. So you could say, I want to be with people like me, people who are of this type of denomination, who are wealthy, who look this way. I'm going to live in this dormitory versus the other people who live in that dormitory. The schools realized over time that this was not a good idea, that basically if you're a school, you want to control what you offer and you want to control how people sort within the school and so on and so forth. So what happened as schools tried to control the population that came in and how it would be distributed, say, on campus, selectivity began. So Columbia implemented admissions, probably the first school, although they all did it very quickly around 1919, for good and for bad reasons. For good reasons, for example, to control the number of students and control the experience better. For bad reasons, including anti-Semitism and stuff like this, which was quite explicit in this period. But what basically Columbia and Yale and many schools did is they just said two things. We're going to cap the size of the entering class. So there's only going to be so many so-called freshmen, first-year undergraduate students, say 400 or something like this. And number two, we're going to collect a lot of information to see who can get in. Some people will be rejected and we won't tell them why. We'll just say, you're accepted, you're rejected, and we won't say why, okay? And this is the model of admissions that still exists in the US. The schools get a lot of information, and then some people are accepted, some people are rejected, but the system is not quite transparent. This happened very quickly at basically Columbia, Yale, Harvard, and then very soon spread to all schools for various reasons. You can also see from a competitive point of view why if your competitor is selecting students, you quickly want to select students as well, okay? Now, this produced a virtuous circle that lasted many, many years for American schools because basically selectivity made for academically stronger students. So a school like Yale could say, now we're choosing students. Every year the students get stronger and stronger and better and better. What does that do? As we all know, one of the best ways to produce excellent graduates is to have excellent incoming students. Hopefully the schools were also getting better at teaching, but you're basically getting excellent incoming students every year better and better. Hopefully getting better teaching, then they go out and they're successful. They're happy with the sorting that they got. They said, I'm a Yale graduate. You should think that I'm a very smart person because I'm a Yale graduate. I should be happy. I should turn around and donate to Yale. I have a vested interest in Yale being good. I'm hoping that Yale takes my own kids. I should donate to Yale. This type of thing produced, it also produced a vicious circle for some schools which were not at the top and found themselves going down. So one of the things that's true about the US is that there's a lot of differentiation. As you know, there's schools that are really rich and really well-resourced, and there are schools that are very poor. This is one of the key periods where that inequality begins to separate. But if you were lucky and you were in the right and you made the right choices, you saw a fiscal virtuous circle begin. The other huge thing that happened around World War II, which I can discuss later in 1 second, which is changing as we speak and has been changing, is that the federal government got into the business of saying, let's fund research ourselves. Basically, the federal government said, we need more research for the war effort, and later we just want more research. And how we're going to do that is by contracting to get research from universities. A big question in this period in the 1950s was, how do you do that? And the answer, after much discussion and politics, was basically, you should try to choose projects, say by the National Science Foundation or the National Institutes of Health, projects that come from universities that claim they will do research. The projects should be selected by experts, by boards of experts. If you do that, what you can imagine is that schools like Stanford, like Berkeley, are going to tend to win those contests and get research funding. So this enhanced the virtuous circle for a school like Berkeley or like Stanford. It's getting richer, it's doing better. Now on top of it, it's hiring really good people. It can put in good proposals to the NIH, let's say, and it starts to get a lot of funding. Same thing for Johns Hopkins. This created, so there's a lot of money from private sources in the US, people paying for very costly tuition, donations, but there's also a lot of money, starting with this period, from public sources, that is the federal government saying we're going to spend money basically paying schools to do research. So meanwhile in Europe, so I go back to Europe for a second, what was going on here? So in the US, we basically, so you know, theoretically, educational markets tend to produce sorting and inequality. So in these papers, for example, what you'll see is if you have a school market and you make some assumptions, just economic assumptions of what a school market does, and you allow free markets to operate, you allow competition, what you're basically going to find is a lot of sorting. There's going to be top schools that select students, a second-ranked school, a third-ranked school, and there's going to be a lot of inequality. That is, the best students get to go to the best schools, which can charge a lot of money, and so on down the food chain. This is what you see in the US. Once again, it operates more or less like a free market. And the story I've told you is one of basically seeing a lot of inequality produced in the US. One argument I make basically is that if you want a Stanford University, which is extremely rich and produces great research, part of the way that the US was able to create that school is a system in which you can observe that there's hundreds of schools in California that are much less resourced than Stanford, that are not producing research and have much less money to spend at all activities, including research. In Europe, of course, this tendency was generally suppressed. Europe is composed of a set of countries that already had controlled school sectors and which did not allow a lot of inequality to operate. So for example, if you look at German states, they largely control their university sectors and they allocate resources across schools equitably. And so the type of dynamics that were leading to huge sorting in the US, with salaries very high for some faculty members in a few schools and salaries low in others, with resources very distributed, were suppressed in Germany and in places like Spain, all around Europe, and this is one reason why the US was also able to take the lead. There's a paper in Spain, for example, that shows that in a recent Shanghai University ranking, the US has 40 schools in the top 100, so that the US is way overrepresented at the very top, which we know is the case, and Spain has exactly 0 in the top 100. On the other hand, 83% of Spanish public universities appear somewhere in the ranking, whereas only 23% of US schools appear in the ranking. So this illustrates this type of inequality. There's a huge number of schools in the US that are not good enough to appear in this ranking. But of course, there's also a few which are extremely good. Spain would be the opposite example. And this type of allowing the market to work worked in the US. I'm going to skip the issue of tenure. I can come back to that later. Let me summarize and then talk, because I'll run out of time. Let me summarize and talk about the present and what's happening and why the US is in a difficult position. US universities at the elite level several of them are in a difficult position right now. So just to summarize, my stories has been one of focus on reforms that began after the Civil War, and understanding their impact benefits from 2 observations. 1, I've emphasized that the US takes a free market approach to education. 2, that this idea of sorting matters quite a bit, and that these 2 forces, basically the market operating and sorting, account for why the US universities were initially weak and for why they became so dominant over time and why they have done so well. Okay? Now, let me move to the present and ask a little bit about the sustainability of this, because what is quite clear is that the US, for the past 50 years or longer, I argue for longer, actually close to 100 years, has had the leading research university sector in the world. And I wrote a paper in 2024. So most of these problems that are happening right now are of 2025. So this is a paper that I wrote before then. And I asked, this was a paper written for a conference in Spain, and I asked what is required to create and to sustain research universities? Because, and I went partially through the story of the US. Creating successful research universities is very difficult. It's a process that requires a long time. It surely requires things like money, but it also requires, as I mentioned, a measurement infrastructure, openness to immigration, all kinds of things. One story which I emphasize, for example, is that the US top schools like Stanford went into a virtuous circle. Part of the virtuous circle was basically having money to hire professors from other schools, but also hire professors from other countries. And we know well, for example, that if you are a top chemistry professor in Europe, for example, there are European schools, I don't know, you know, in Switzerland, for example, that are great. But on average, you will find the US quite attractive, and Stanford might be able to try to attract you, or you know, Berkeley and so on. So what are the things that are necessary to sustain? I'll go through now, and then why might these be at risk in the US? So one key thing is that you know, creating and sustaining a successful research university requires attracting a supply of talent, and this requires openness to the world. And this, you know, Germany benefited from this for a long time. So, for example, in 1910, I would say, or 1890 for sure, if you were a very ambitious, very smart American kid, and you said, I would like to be an academic in 1880, okay, and I would like to really know everything that there is to know about biology, people would have told you, you should go to study in Germany. And in fact, lots of people did that. There were lots of wealthy Americans in 1870 going to get PhDs in Germany. The story flipped, right? And now you might find a very, very talented French person, and they say, you know, who has the luck to have the means to do anything in life, and says, I'd like to be a really well-trained economist, and someone might advise them and say, you know, you should go to grad school or undergrad in the US and be there. And this requires an openness to talent that is about faculty and is also about students. This, as you know, is a little bit in question that the US presently is sustaining this, as there is news even this morning, for example, about visas restrictions for students or for faculty members. This is inconsistent with basically sustaining and creating excellent research universities. Second point, that in order to sustain a top university, you need to sustain public funding and popular support. So public funding is important. It's crucial in the US for the research endeavor. There are schools, so for example, people always claim that Harvard is enormously wealthy, or that Columbia is enormously wealthy, and this is true. But a lot of the wealth is tied up into specific purpose vehicles, I would call them. That's not a technical term, but basically says there's an endowment and there's a lot of money, but that money is dedicated to funding a classics professor. And if the university says, I'd like to do research on AI, on artificial intelligence or something new, that money cannot be used for that because it's for the purposes of funding a classics professor. So it looks like these schools have a lot of money, and in some sense they do, but that money is not fully flexible. And for funding research, for example, in new areas, in you know, pharmaceuticals and stuff like this, public funding is crucial. And the other thing is that generally it is important for all institutions, as we know, to sort of maintain popular support, that people have to say, you know, there's something good that you're doing. So one thing that has happened in the US is, just as I've told you, like that there's been this process that generated a lot of inequality over decades. One perception that has developed, so I will cite two perceptions that I see as quite problematic in the US. One is that schools like Yale or something are repositories, are basically repositories of privilege, that they're privilege incorporated, right? That there's privileged kids who go there, and that the school is privileged itself. And second, that they're engines of inequality, that they basically is one way in which families and children who are more successful get a further sense. These are perceptions. I'm not claiming this is true. I'm just saying this is a perception that's out there. A second perception is basically that universities are captured by ideologies that has developed in the US, that people might say, that some people believe and say, look, Harvard, rather than being focused on research and teaching, has focused on other things for kind of ideological reasons, and that is because, you know, given groups have basically manage to capture the university for their purposes. I'm not claiming once again that this is true. I'm just saying these are two perceptions that are widespread and that are problematic. And this creates a real problem in the US because as a result of these perceptions, partially, public support is following, private support is following. I'm almost out of time, so let me close by saying what should universities do in this context. One is that they have to actively show that A, they contribute to the social good. And in fact, universities contribute to the social good all the time, right? We know that research is basically produced and that research that, for example, we know that everyone in this room benefited from the availability of the COVID vaccine, and we know that the COVID vaccines, a large part of the fundamental research for that went on in universities. But actively showing and focusing on this and focusing the work on that is important. Two, the universities must show that they train a useful elite, that the training is good for business, it's good for public policy, and this is something that must be demonstrated all the time. And second, focus on basically that they promote meritocracy and access, that somehow the great treatment and the privilege that they confer and the great sort of career outcomes are open to different people. Finally, I'll say that universities should try to appeal widely. It's not a good idea, in my personal view, if the university starts to lose public support, right? And we've seen this, for example, in recent polls in the US, that there's a large, that depending on the poll you look at, there's a plurality of people who say that the university is on the wrong track. This is a problem. This is a problem. An institution or type of institution that wants to sustain itself should have most of society thinking, there's something good going on where you do. Part of this, I think, is understanding, for the university to understand well what its comparative advantage is. Here, speaking like an economist, what is that a university does better than anyone else in society? And trying to focus its activity on that. And secondly, that may not be obvious to society, but basically trying to explain that and trying to articulate that for people. I said I would be done 20 minutes ahead, and it's 19, so I'm going to stop there. Thanks. Thank you. Thank you.
Grazie per...
Thank you. Thank you so much for this interesting presentation. Now we do have some time for questions from the audience.
We'll see. Otherwise, I'll ask you for help.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. My name is Andrea Gavosto. I think it was very interesting reconstruction, very convincing one. I have just one question and one comment on your final slide. One question is, okay, you explained very well why research university managed to attract the best students overall and so on. The question is, in US you have extraordinarily good teaching colleges as well, side to side with research university. Why didn't they ever manage to attract as good students as research universities? Is that because of research reputation, things like that? Why didn't it develop the same way as research university? And if I can make the final comment is, I entirely agree with your final suggestion on what we would call a third mission or third wave, so sort of explaining dissemination of research. The problem there is you have to change the structure of incentives of university professors, because clearly now careers are mostly made by research achievement rather than the dissemination ability.
Thanks. Yeah, I forgot to bring a pen, so it's great if I can answer them one at a time. So I can answer that, yes. So there were two questions, one about the sort of teaching colleges and the dissemination. So this is a very interesting and useful question. So there is some distinction in the US between research universities and teaching colleges, and the teaching colleges might be colleges that, rather than trying to advance research, just say, I'm going to focus on teaching itself. And interestingly, there are schools that are of extremely high quality in students of the two types. So let me mention two schools. Okay, so if you look at Williams College, which is a college in Massachusetts, I think, but excellent school. It is one of the top-ranked liberal arts schools in the US, also very wealthy. I would say that there are many points in history where Williams was a stronger and wealthier school for sure than Columbia University. They were both colleges in the distant past. Williams was wealthier. Now, when these things began to happen, these reforms, Columbia made a deliberate choice that said, I'm going to turn myself into a research university, and I'm going to try to compete with Johns Hopkins, and I'm going to hire people mainly because they're doing research. Williams made a contrast choice. It basically said, I'm not going to open PhD programs. I'm going to remain a college and choose to focus on teaching. Both schools can be good. Both are excellent, and both get students who I would say are of the same quality or of comparable quality. Maybe there's some good sorting that happens, like matching, where a kid says, I would really like to study chemistry, and somehow the Columbia large labs appeal to me and Williams are not as big. Whereas a different kid might say, what I want to study, which is going to be more economics or philosophy, maybe I would rather have smaller classes. And there is some trade-off, as we all know. When a faculty member is very focused on research, they maybe are a little bit less focused on paying attention in the classroom and having small classes. And so these are trade-offs that happen. But there's no automatic mapping in the US between quality and these two types of missions. On the dissemination front, this just gets back to what I said earlier. You get in a university what you pay for at some level. And what you pay for is sort of you get what you reward. And it's true that in the US, for example, our economics profession is a clear example. What is the currency? What is the reward? Economics articles. I was discussing this with some economists at dinner last night. We don't necessarily get rewarded because our research is legible to the broad public. And so as a result, it's not shocking. We may not put that much emphasis on that. And so the dissemination piece, I agree with you. On the other hand, one question, if you ever say, I'd like the university not to do this, but rather to do that, one key point immediately is going to become one of measurement, right? So I take part in Columbia in the tenure procedures, which is when we discuss whether a professor should get a lifetime appointment. And I like to look at things that are easily measurable, and I can measure journal quality much easier than I can measure dissemination quality. So the measures might be an obstacle. Thanks for those great questions.
So thank you for the talk, Miguel. Very interesting. So my name is Juan Vargas. I also have two very brief questions.
Yep.
The first one is the story that you told about this sort of virtuous circle of right investments at the beginning.
Yes.
Right investments at the beginning, and that creates this huge inequality. It's a story about private institutions, right? So Harvard, Princeton, Hopkins, Cornell, Chicago.
Yeah.
But then if you look at the universities in the elite today, there are also some public institutions, right? So they use the system, Berkeley, UCLA, University of Michigan.
Yeah.
So I missed the story about those institutions.
How did
that
that
is
happen?
one question.
Yeah.
The other one is that how, so we understand from your last slide, what are the things that universities need to do, like appeal to the general public, etc.
Yeah.
So how to seal the universities if they need public funding, right? Because they cannot decouple from public funding from, from crazy autocrats. I guess that's
from like external pressure, you mean?
Yeah, I mean from like random shocks of sort of leadership, the leadership that doesn't understand the system.
Right.
Like it's going on right now in the US.
Yeah, I understand. So again, two questions. One question is, what is the story of public universities? So there are public universities in the US, and I glossed over this is true, and thank you, that are extremely good. So for example, I work at Columbia, and I work on the recruitment and retention of faculty, and Berkeley is one of my headaches. And Berkeley is a public university. So there, I would say that what happened is that some states in the US, not all, decided that they wanted to get into the game, and I think this is a rational game. So one thing that recent research shows is that, if I live in Torino and there's great discoveries made in MIT about robotics or something, I can benefit here in Torino, just as I benefited living in, say, Colombia from, say, living in South America from COVID vaccines and stuff like that. So there's a public good component. But there's also evidence that this is somewhat localized, that you would rather have a university closer to you for the strength of your economy and so on. So some states rationally got into the game of saying, I would like to have a university that could be public, that is going to be excellent. As you mentioned, there aren't that many. There are certainly great public universities in the US that give a headache to the very best private ones, including Berkeley, Michigan, Virginia, you name it. But even there, notice one that in the case of California, for example, California also said as a state, I'm going to be comfortable with the US way of doing things, which is there's going to be Berkeley and UCLA and so they're going to be extremely well-heeled and wealthy, and I'm going to put a lot of money into them. And there's going to be a Cal State sector and a California Community College sector that's a lot less. So the type of variety and inequality that exists in the private sector in the US to some extent is replicated in the public sector, particularly when that public sector features stars like Berkeley or like UCLA. So there isn't, I think, a huge asymmetry. The source of the money is different. And then the second question you asked is if a university has to take public funding, like US universities do, including private ones, how do they protect themselves from, as you said, volatility, for example, in what the government believes? The short answer, I would say, is that it's difficult to protect yourself. So if we go back to the 1950s, when the design of things, or the 1940s actually, when the design of things like the National Institutes of Health or the National Science Foundation was going on, people discussed, is this a good idea or not? And there were people at Harvard, this was actually a debate that said, this is a bad idea. We should not have a system where the federal government directly gives money to universities for research. Why? For two reasons. One is other schools than Harvard may get the money, including schools close by. But two, and this is less flippant, they said we will be exposed to the pressure, right? And so that's if you are doing work for an entity that can take the funding away, you will be exposed to pressure. And I think that those people foresaw things that could happen, and I should say it's not only about research funding. The US universities get federal funding in many ways, and through years there has been different ways of basically putting pressure on them. For example, if you are not compliant with rulings called like Title VI or Title IX, we'll take the money away from you. These are very strong pressures. They become salient in given periods, like they're salient right now, but they've been going on for decades. And unless you totally insulate yourself and say, I'm going to operate as a private entity and not take money at all from the public sector, it's very hard to guarantee that you won't come under pressure. I think I just see it as a fact.
Yeah. Three questions.
Okay.
First, what is the role of the policies in Europe in the 30s when you have the diaspora of German scientists going to the US? Second question is, in a fragmented world, we are going to a fragmented world, is there any benefit in having research decentralized, in the sense that maybe group thinking is bad, and during the Cold War you had some benefits in having some research in other places? Third is very difficult question. Could you name 2 or 3 very good policies that the Trump administration is implemented? We know the bad, but could you name at least 2 good policies for research?
Good policies for research.
For the university, very good.
Okay. So three questions, each of them hard. Let me see if I can remember them first. So first question, 1930s. The 1930s had a huge role in first in that graph that I showed where basically Germany goes down like this and the US. Of course, that is a big part of the story in Germany, and there's no question that the US benefited enormously from the exodus of top academics from Germany in the 1930s. The story that I'm telling is that basically that didn't come out of a vacuum, in the sense that if I were a German academic, a very successful one, and I decide in the 1930s I need to leave Germany for my own survival, I look around, right, and I say, I'd like to keep doing what I'm doing, and I'd like to keep having a good environment. And I could have gone to the UK, I could have gone to lots of places. And so the fact that many of those scientists moved to the US, I think showed that the US was already basically making a set of attractive schools that could say, you know what, maybe you should go to Columbia, because this will be like a place that is good for you. So I'm not underplaying the role of the 1930s. It's a huge role. I don't think it's a good idea for anyone or analytically for people in the US to think the reason we have good schools is because something that happened in Europe in the 1930s. I'll speak as someone who lives in the US. We should understand why our schools are good, and we should work to keep them good. And thinking, oh, they're good just because someone came to power in Berlin in the 1930s doesn't capture the story. So analytically, I think it is good to think of that. The second question was on the decentralization of research. I think it is important to decentralize research, even regionally. There's several papers recently that show this, but let me cite one. And I forget the authors, but for example, there's papers that show that in the US there was funding for agricultural type research. This will not be a shocking finding, but it illustrates a lot of things. And the funding went to specific places, like this part of Illinois or this part of upstate New York, this part of Texas. And they show causally, in a causal sense, that this impacted agricultural productivity positively. But that the effects were closest to where these schools were. So that basically, and this is not shocking, discoveries about the right way to plant corn in Illinois should be useful in Arkansas, but they're probably most useful initially in Illinois. So I think that there's a big argument for having fairly decentralized research, including questions about like distributing activities such that it's less subject to pressure. So I think that there's a strong argument for that, and this may be why it's a good idea, for example, as Juan mentioned, that California elected to invest so much in its public schools, and so there's Berkeley, there's UCLA, there's San Diego, which are excellent. A different state like Massachusetts did not. It doesn't seek to compete with Harvard and MIT, but that having the countrywide decentralization is good. In Europe, which has a huge market, I think that the fact that there's increasing integration between universities and between academic markets, between people being able to study and teach in different places is a great thing. I think that that having a strong, large market that also features decentralization is a good thing. And then finally, the last question and the most difficult one, you asked me to mention policies of the Trump administration that are positive for universities. And so as you mentioned, it's easy to find some that are not. So maybe it's hard for me to, so let me mention one. I think that there's ideas in the Trump administration that could be useful. Like there's ideas about for example, changes in regulation that are related to topics like innovation that, that basically GIANLUCA works on, that I think show like a good impulse. It's a question of having to implement them. There's questions about trying to there's talk about trying to change the government in ways that make it more efficient. This, as economists, we know that's a good idea. Executing it is difficult and requires a lot. So I think that there are good ideas there, but a lot of the execution maybe is still. And of course, then there are things that are detrimental to universities, and anything that, things like, impeding the flow of talent to the US, whether in the form of students or of faculty, is something that is going to hurt the country. And as people were saying earlier, hurts the world in general, because the whole world benefits when there is innovation and research wherever it happens.
I would like to come back to some of the lessons that we learned from the US history.
Yeah.
So public universities compete in the US, so it's kind of normal. I mean, it's very difficult to do this in Europe, especially in Italy. So strong opposition, even among the researchers. So I would like to have your thought why about this opposition to competition. Yeah. Second, as you mentioned, California. So I mean, there are different kinds of universities. So Italy, just most of the universities are public. It's impossible to think that we have 80 universities competing with the top. So it would make sense, for example, to have just 4 or 5. Yeah. So what do you think about a policy like that? Just finding 5, 10 big universities and the rest like liberal college.
Yeah. No, I think that my sense is that there are trade-offs, of course. There's no, as we know well in economics, there's no system that you say, I'm going to design school, system A and system B and claim that system A is going to dominate on everything. There are trade-offs. But I think that if your goal is to generate research universities that compete at the top level, My sense is that having aspects that are sort of competition and market-friendly things is just good, basically. It'll generally produce better. It produces tricky dynamics. Like, for example, I think that what is going on in the US right now is related to the fact that this produced inequality. It produced a perception that something's wrong. So it produces tricky dynamics. But I think that basically allowing some form of competition is just very important. One question which I discuss in the book I wrote is that it is somewhat mysterious why the US developed in this way and Europe did not. So if you ask, for example, Americans, and you ask people at Harvard, how was Harvard designed? The claim that is a little bit of the usual kind of American, what used to be insecurity is, oh, it was just modeled on Cambridge, or William and Mary was just modeled on Oxford, as if what the US had been trying to do was just to emulate Europe, which is a common American impulse, is to say, oh, it's just like Europe. But in fact, what you're pointing out is institutionally, it looks very different. And the question, one question which I address is why did the US develop a market system and Europe did not? In fact, the original free market university system is European. If you go back far enough into the high Middle Ages, you could open universities, and there was lots of competition. Basically, the University of Paris, lots of places were opening, and there was a lot of competition. What killed that here is the Reformation, and then this idea of basically state control and no competition came. And the US was just lucky, I think, that it started creating its colleges enough after the Reformation that, in fact, the idea became, let's have competition between denominations and make it a free-for-all, where if you're Baptist and I'm Presbyterian, we can each open our school, but we should not expect public subsidies, and we should just be left to compete and try to survive. And why one did one and the other, I see a little bit as an accident of history.
Dunque, grazie a tutti.
Thank you, everyone. Unfortunately, we have running out of time, so we have to conclude.